Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time the Army of the Potomac launched numerous attacks against the Confederate entrenchments known as the Harris Line. Now Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade attempt to cut the Petersburg Railroad. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade discussed the failed attacks by their army outside of Petersburg. Meade regretted that the attacks didn't yield a greater success, but Grant expressed full satisfaction by the soldiers since their actions on June 15th. He wrote, "Now we will rest the men and use the spade for their protection until a new vein can be struck." Meade realized his failure. Writing months later, he explained that he should have taken Petersburg because of his numerical superiority, but he fully understood that the Overland Campaign, and now the siege, was wreaking havoc on his army. He wrote, "Indeed, the army is exhausted with 49 days of continued marching and fighting, and absolutely requires rest to prevent its morale being impaired. We cannot replace the officers lost with experienced men, and there is not time for reorganization or careful selection. This army has not accomplished all that ignorant people anticipated. It has really done more than could reasonably have been counted on." The Federal troops began to dig in, making impressive structures to withstand the hail of iron and lead from the rebel earthworks. This would secure the toehold on what ground they had bought with their blood over the last couple of days. One soldier wrote about his experience that, "My pit was dug into the side of the bank, with but a piece of poncho fastened with sticks over my head and the sun piercing down on the red, sandy clay ground, baked and cracking, and with a small supply of water." The soldier decided to test the marksmanship of the Confederate sharpshooters, and raised a hat on his sword above his pit, and, in a second, I had 4 holes through it. I quit then. Robert E. Lee was now fully aware that Grant's army was set to besiege Petersburg and cut all communications and supplies from entering the city, effectively starving out Richmond. Lee needed to keep the railroads in operation as long as possible, but knew that Grant at the very least would make them run irregularly until he would eventually cut them. Lee wanted to concentrate on the more western railroads running into the city, but the Secretary of War, James Seddon, asked him to try to keep the Weldon Railroad that ran to Wilmington open for 3 weeks until the North Carolina wheat crop could be harvested and brought into the city. Lee told Seddon that he couldn't maintain that railroad in the long term, and to direct as much freight through Danville as possible. One of Lee's most trusted corps commanders, A.P. Hill, was now on the scene with his entire corps. He extended the Confederate line westward in an attempt to hold on to as much of their rail line as possible. Hill's movement west coincided with Grant and Meade's decision to use the 2nd and 6th Corps as a mobile strike force in an attempt to capture the railroads running into Petersburg. The entire army began to shuffle around as those 2 corps moved to the west, extending the Union Army's left flank. On June 20th, President Abraham Lincoln arrived at City Point to meet with Grant. A soldier described the president, all dressed in black, as looking very much like a boss undertaker. The president greeted Grant and said, "I just thought I would jump aboard a boat and come down. I don't expect I can do much good, and in fact I'm afraid I may do some harm, but I'll put myself under your orders, and if you find me doing anything wrong, just send me right away." Grant laughed and the 2 men talked. Then Lincoln went with Grant to the front to examine the Union positions around Petersburg. Wherever they went, Union soldiers gathered and cheered the commander-in-chief. After their visit with the Army of the Potomac, Grant and Lincoln went back to City Point, then steamed upriver to Bermuda Hundred to examine Benjamin Butler's position. By June 22nd, the 2nd Corps was in position on the left, and the 6th Corps was right behind and to the south of their position. Confederate cavalry found the Union troops and notified Hill and Lee. Hill dispatched his far-right division under Cadmus Wilcox south, and then Wilcox turned east to the Federals in front of him. Hill had ordered him to push the enemy back to the Jerusalem Plank Road. Wilcox advanced a good distance and then halted, believing he had done what Hill had ordered. Meanwhile, Lee got information about the enemy threat and ordered William Mahone's division of Hill's corps to attack the enemy's flank. Mahone's men moved out and aligned themselves to assault the Union division of Francis Barlow. Barlow was a tough fighter, having been left for dead on the Gettysburg battlefield, but recovered. However, he wasn't ready for Mahone's attack, which rolled up his line, sending the brigades of Maroney, McDougal, and Fraser running rapidly for the rear. The devastating attack threw the division into chaos, but Barlow was able to locate Nelson Miles's brigade, who took up a position behind some breastworks and held off the attack. Mahone's men came to a halt and then pulled back a little to find another foe less prepared for their attack. When Mahone regrouped, he threw his men against the Union flank again, with the same results as the time before. The Union brigade skedaddled, running toward the Jerusalem Plank Road. Mahone called up another brigade, the Mississippians under Nathaniel Harris, to come up on his right to help ease the pressure on his right flank. Union Army Commander George Meade heard about the attacks as they were progressing through the afternoon and into the evening. He, Birney, and the 2nd Corps division commanders scrambled to put together a stable defense. As the sun was about to set, Barlow's men were ready to launch a counterattack. They advanced from the road, but were met by heavy volleys from the Confederate guns. A stalemate developed, with neither side able to dislodge the other. Mahone's right was slightly threatened, but it never broke under the weight of the approaching Federals. Wilcox's division was also moving behind Mahone's division, with Wilcox leaving only a skirmish line where his last offensive line rested. Mahone thought it best for his division to return to the main Petersburg defenses, and Hill agreed. Wilcox and Mahone returned to their earthworks after a job well done. Wilcox's skirmishers were attacked by Horatio Wright's 6th Corps, driving the rebels away. One South Carolinian remembered his brush with the Federal divisions. "You ought to seen them fat Yankees run. They run atter me. A hollin', 'Stop, you rebel!' Says I to myself, 'You too fat, Yankee. You get too much to eat over your side. You don't catch me, and you ought to seed me as I slid past 'em.'" Meade was irate that such a disaster had befallen the 2nd Corps as well as the 6th, and ordered them to retake their positions, starting at 3:30 a.m. The 2nd Corps did so, but the 6th lagged behind. Meade pressured Wright to get his corps moving so that the line could be stabilized. What materialized was Russell and Ricketts' divisions connected to the 2nd Corps, and Wheaton's division bent back toward the Jerusalem Plank Road. When Wright and a staff member of Meade's returned to Wright's headquarters, a captain in the 3rd Vermont came to them with a telegraph wire in his hand. The captain declared that he advanced that morning on the 23rd with between 80 and 100 sharpshooters and got to the tracks of the Petersburg Railroad, and were able to cut the telegraph wire. So, with enough men, destroying the track should be easy. Wright sent the 3rd, 11th, and 4th Vermont and the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry to guard that flank and rip up the railroad. Hill called on Mahone again to send the Federals back in a retreat and get them away from the railroad. The Confederate division moved south on the west side of the railroad. Because of their late-night march back to the Petersburg defenses, Mahone had let them sleep in the next day, so they were refreshed for their long march. After 3 p.m., the Federals working to disrupt the railroad could hear the rebels moving their way. Mahone's men crashed into the Union troops, routing the blue-clad soldiers in such a quick manner that many had no option to run. They simply surrendered. Mahone drove all the way to the main Union line, saving the railroad for the time being. Mahone pulled back, having deprived the 2nd and 6th Corps of the Petersburg Railroad for the 2nd day in a row. Although it's difficult to get the exact estimates for the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road, some use the following numbers. The Union lost 2,962 soldiers, most of them being captured and sent south to the prison camp at Andersonville in Georgia. The Confederates lost 572, an incredibly small amount compared to their opponent, with most of them coming from Mahone's division. As the battle for the Jerusalem Plank Road came to an end, one of Grant's other plans was developing, striking at another sector in the Confederate defenses.